Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. Today I am here to do a book review of Young Mungo by Douglas Stuart. This is his follow-up to Shuggie Bain, which won the Booker Prize in 2020, I think, somewhere around there. Point is, it won the Booker Prize. This was his debut, and Young Mungo is his follow-up. And I loved Shuggie Bain. It was one of my top 3 reads in the year in which I read it. I believe it was 2020 because they didn't have a Booker ceremony the year that he won. He was on by Zoom, so that would make sense in terms of timing. And then last year, which was 21, so this is really checking out, he actually got to go to the Booker ceremony and hand off to the next winner, which was Damon Galgut for The Promise. So yes, that timeline checks out. I loved this book. It was one of my favorite reads, as I said, so I was really looking forward to anything that he did next, and I was really looking forward to Young Mungo. I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of it through NetGalley, and now I am here to talk about it. I already briefly talked about it in a Friday Reads video, and I had said that I was going to do a review. I read it in January. We are now mid-February, so I've kind of sat with the book for a little bit, but I really wanted to release a review, so here I am. Now, just a quick warning, I am not going to do spoilers in this review. I won't talk about plot elements that happen, but I am going to discuss the structure and the plot of Young Mungo. So if you want to go into this book with a fresh mind, if you don't want to know really much about it at all, you might want to skip this video. Like I said, I am not going to do spoilers. I'm not going to talk about what happens or anything important that is revealed in the latter half of the book. But just know, if you want to go in with a fresh mind and not knowing too much about the book, you might want to skip the review. I had originally been torn about whether or not I wanted to do a spoiler review or a non-spoiler review. And I think that's where the little bit of lag time between when I read the book and now comes into play. The reason I was so urgent to do a spoiler review was that I felt like there were a lot of things about the book that I wanted to talk about, and now I've sat and processed them, so I feel like I can do a non-spoiler review. So that is what I'm going to do here. And Guinness is going to come over and sit with me for this. So if you're unfamiliar, Shuggie Bain is a book that is kind of inspired by Douglas Stuart's childhood. It is set in Glasgow in the 1980s, and I believe into the 1990s. And the character of Shuggie Bain is sort of a stand-in for him. Shuggie has an alcoholic mother who he really cares for and loves, despite the abuse that he suffers at her hands, the alcoholism and the way it destroys their family and everything around them in many ways. It is not an easy book to read in light of all that. One of the things that I really liked about it is that although I don't have similar experiences in terms of location, and my family started out more working class, but by the time I was about 10 years old, my father had made a good amount of money, so I was could no longer call myself working class. It was much more upper middle class. And Shuggie Bain is very working class. So I had kind of left all of that behind, and in fact, when I lived in what could be called working class, I was too young to really experience it. But still, I had an alcoholic mother, and I was a young, closeted gay boy, and Shuggie Bain really spoke to an experience of the world that I had. And usually when you read a story about someone who has a parent who is an addict, it feels angry, and it feels sad. And Shuggie Bain is sad, but what really shines through is the love that Shuggie Bain has for his mother and how complicated that is in the ways in which he needs to leave her behind in order to move ahead in his own life. And that really spoke to me. That's why this is such a great, important book to me. But we're not really here to talk about this, except that there are similarities between Shuggie Bain and Young Mungo. You could say that Shuggie Bain casts a long shadow over Young Mungo because it is a sophomore novel, Young Mungo that is, and that is always a tricky thing. People are always waiting for the sophomore slump to hit. There's a little bit of an element of Schadenfreude there, but because there are similarities between the two books. So if you want to compare these two books, and I'm going to keep talking even though the garbage truck is at my neighbor's house and is about to be at my house. So if there's noise in the background, I apologize. But if you want to compare these two books, it really doesn't help that both of them center on a tender-hearted young gay boy in 1980s/1990s Glasgow who is desperately caring for an alcoholic mother who conspicuously is not caring for him. And it also doesn't help that the fact that young Mungo is so eager to keep his mother happy that causes friction with his siblings, who are much more capable of seeing their mother for who she is. That is basically Shuggie Bain in a nutshell. The central premise of both books is essentially the same. But from there, the similarities really stop. And I do think that Young Mungo has a very different take on this scenario. And I think he gets out of the shadow of Shuggie Bain and creates a story that's kind of in the same ballpark, but succeeds in its own right. And so I'm okay with the fact that they start with very similar situations because they go in different directions. In Young Mungo, the story takes place in two different timelines. In the first, we meet a bruised Mungo recovering from mysterious injuries as he is sent on a fishing trip to become more of a man with two men that his mother has met in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. The fact that she doesn't even know these men that she has entrusted her son to matters less to her than the idea that she makes a show of getting him a sort of proper manly education, which is something that Mungo has been missing since he lacks a father. Innocent Mungo is woefully unprepared for what he is going to find on this fishing trip, from his attire, which is gym shorts, which will do nothing to protect him from the cold at the loch or lake once they get there. And also in terms of what he packs for this trip, which is a board game and a sketchbook. And that is sort of meant to show that he is still a child. He is only on the cusp of becoming a man. The second storyline flashes back a few months earlier. So we meet Mungo as he is leaving his house and his mother sort of waving him on to go on this fishing trip. And then he journeys to the lake with the two men. And then the story flashes back to a few months earlier to sort of show how he got to that point. Now, in that second storyline, we find young Mungo's mother drifting in and out of his life, mostly out. And significantly, anytime she has a boyfriend or something better, she leaves the house and just abandons the children to take care of themselves. And in this case, she has found a boyfriend. And one of the tricky things about this is that early on, they find out that this boyfriend has kids. So she has essentially left them to go play mother to other kids in order to please her boyfriend. And of course, obviously this causes some tension in the family. But while the mother is gone, Mungo is left in the care of his disapproving sister, Jody. Jody loves Mungo fiercely, but she's disapproving of the mother and the situation there. And the fact that Jody is only a year older than Mungo, but she has been forced into a caretaker role by circumstance, not only of Mungo, but of their older brother as well. And it's a role that she has grown to resent over time. She doesn't want to have to take care of her family when she is young. She wants to be out on her own, and she has her own resentful issues with the situation and the role that she has been forced to take simply because she is a girl. And there are a lot of really interesting things and dynamics that happen in her storyline because of that. Their big brother, Hamish, has moved into another apartment with his underage girlfriend and the baby that they had together, overseen by the girlfriend's disapproving mother. Hamish's response to his life circumstances and his poor prospects to do better was to become a gang leader and employing a ragtag group of neighborhood boys to wage war against the Catholics in the area. Mungo tries to avoid his brother as much as possible, but Hamish has this really powerful gravitational orbit, and his tendency toward violence combined with that gravitational orbit keeps pulling Mungo closer. One, because he can't really escape the orbit of his brother, but because his brother is prone to violence, he has to sort of placate him and go along with what he's trying to get him to do. The one bright spot in Mungo's life once he meets him is James, a lonely Catholic boy who takes care of pigeons in the neighborhood. And their friendship is forbidden because of their religion, but things really get worse when a romance begins to bloom between the two young boys. And James also has a complicated family situation and also has abandonment issues because his father works on an oil rig, his mother has died, and he is left alone to his own devices. So you have these two boys who are essentially abandoned and have these ties to their family and the big emotional longings in regard to their family, and are really coming into their own as people and discovering who they are, and discovering that who they are is something that society does not approve of. And they really struggle with that together and separately. Now, in that second storyline, the one that is set a few months earlier, Young Mungo really builds off of Shuggie Bain in effective ways. It stays in the same ballpark, as I said, but expands to explore new, if similar, dynamics. Economic displacement, largely thanks to Thatcher-era politics, looms large, as it did in Shuggie Bain. And the role of women in a male-dominated society, especially a violent male-dominated society, looms large. That is something that is definitely in Shuggie Bain, but it feels like it is expanded on in Young Mungo in some pretty profound ways. You have a downstairs neighbor who lives in the apartment building with Young Mungo and his family, and there are interesting twists and turns with that character as well. And again, I'm not going to really talk about what the twists and turns are. I'm just setting the book up. That happens really early on, so I wouldn't say it's a spoiler. And then, as in Shuggie Bain, Douglas Stuart's palpable compassion for every single one of his characters means that you really understand them, even if you don't like them or what they do. I would say there's at least one exception. There's at least one character that Douglas Stuart does not like, and you are clearly meant to dislike as well. But I can't really talk about that one because it would involve a spoiler. So I'd say all except for one. In this book, there is one character that he does not have compassion for, and there are reasons for that I can't talk about. But I will say that in lesser hands, the character of Hamish would have been really one note and flat. He would have just been a caricature of brute gang violence. And to some degree, he still kind of is, but Stuart really makes sure that you see the hurt and disappointment that is motivating everything that he does, and the ways in which he has tried to step up to be a father figure and a big brother, and has failed by his own doing and by the situation that he found himself in. And it makes him a compelling character, if not necessarily a likable one. It's this second storyline where Young Mungo shines, which makes it a pity that Douglas Stuart appears to have counted on the first storyline to hammer in most of his themes. And I do mean hammer. The first storyline is brutal, unrelenting, and at times difficult to read. Not because of the writing, but because of what happens in it. Subtlety would probably be impossible because of what happens in this storyline, and the intensity of that first storyline doesn't really match the quiet desperation of the other, which does have fits of violence and like bursts of big activity, but it feels more organic in the second storyline. And in the first, it feels kind of lurid. And again, I can't talk about what happens, but I felt really jarred and unmoored, which is probably the point. But again, I'm just not convinced that the two storylines play well together. In fact, I can't help thinking that Young Mungo would be a better book without the first storyline. If you edited it out completely, you really wouldn't lose much. The second storyline has all the points that Stuart seems to want to make about the time, the setting, and how dangerous it was to be young and gay at the time, and how revolutionary living an honest and authentic life was. And you can extrapolate off of that and say how revolutionary it still is and how dangerous it still is as well. But he's really focusing in on this specific time and place. But really, all you would need are minor edits to the conclusion, and it would work just fine without the first storyline. And again, I think it would work better because you could also offer proper conclusions to storylines in the second timeline that are kind of left hanging. For instance, the one with poor wee Chickie, who is a gay man who lives a sort of solitary life, being bullied by neighborhood boys and shunned by neighbors, but who has a big impact on Mungo. And the more I think about it, the more I think that Young Mungo becomes even more the book that Douglas Stuart wanted to write if he would only remove the first storyline from it completely. And I will also say that there is another flaw with the two storylines in that the first relies on Mungo still possessing a sort of childish innocence. It depends on a sort of youthful naivete. This is, after all, a young boy who wore gym shorts on a camping trip and innocently packed board games in a sketchbook, thinking that he was going to have a fun time. And by the time you reach the end of the book, I genuinely question that depiction of Mungo. The second storyline takes place months earlier, and I wouldn't necessarily call the Mungo who emerges from the events of that storyline or that timeline childish. He's been through too much to be the Mungo that you meet on the first page. It's a structural flaw that isn't glaringly obvious, but it is still a problem. And you can see the difference between the two sides of Young Mungo at play in the differences between the UK and US designs for the dust jacket. It is not uncommon for a book to have different dust jacket designs in the US and the UK. And Young Mungo is no exception in terms of that. The exception for Young Mungo is that both covers are visually quite stunning. Usually there is one that is vastly superior to the other one. Now, interestingly, now that I've read the book, I see that the different covers reflect the different storylines. The American cover ties to the first storyline where Mungo goes camping or on a fishing trip, featuring a young boy with the lower half of his face submerged underwater. It's a beautiful image. It's a striking image. It feels sad in tone and somehow disquieting because obviously, looking at the photo, you know the boy can't breathe. And you kind of wonder to yourself, is he holding still? Is he enjoying a peaceful moment? Is he submerging himself into the water? Is he hiding? Is he seeking refuge where he can't actually survive? Or is he rising to the world above? You know, his nose is so close to the surface of the water, after all. And given the book we get with Young Mungo, I think this is the more appropriate cover for the book. The UK version features a famous photograph of two young men kissing in a nightclub. Context into the photo and why it was chosen is key here, but even without that, you can see why it's an audacious cover that is a wee bit provocative. It seems to be asking, are you offended? And if you are offended, why are you offended? The very question reveals how revolutionary an image of two men kissing still is in society. It reveals that gay love is inherently an act of rebellion. And this is what Young Mungo should be. And unfortunately, it's what the first storyline dulls by being so, so much. I can't really talk about it without spoiling the book, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone who wants to read it, so we're going to have to leave it at that. But I think the UK cover reflects what the book should have and could have been, and the American cover reflects what it is. In the end, I like Young Mungo, and I continue to adore Douglas Stuart. Every interview I see of him is fascinating and a delight. He seems like a really genuine and kind person who has been through a lot in his life. And I think that his voice is an important one. I'm glad that he has found so much success as a writer. I hope his voice continues. And I will say, I do hope that he begins to move further away from the template of Shuggie Bain in the future. But what I will say that Young Mungo proves that he has enough to say in this universe that he could get at least one or two more books out of it if he's careful. I'd love to see him write a contemporary story set in Glasgow, for one thing. I think that would be a really fascinating take and a fascinating evolution of the type of story that he tells, because we've had two books dealing with working class Glasgow in or shortly after the Thatcher era. I'd love to see what Glasgow is like now, and maybe in particular what gay life in Glasgow is like now. So I think he could even explore similar terrain just by doing a contemporary story. And I, for one, would sign on for that immediately. And who knows, maybe he will in the future. It'll be interesting to see what he does next. I do think that both of these books work, but it will be interesting to see if he stays in this same wheelhouse for his next book or if he branches out into something else. In the end, it's just that as much as I appreciate what Douglas Stuart is doing with Young Mungo, it's not going to have the same impact on me that Shuggie Bain did. The great shame of it is that I'm always going to wonder that if it would have had the same impact as Shuggie Bain if that first storyline had been excised. And I will say, as it is, I still think about Shuggie Bain, and it's been almost 2 years since I read it. And it has now been a month since I read Young Mungo, and I confess I haven't thought about it as much. And part of that is because of some of the things that happen in that first storyline are very provocative. And again, no spoilers, but I think it left me just a little bit disoriented and distanced from the book. And I think it would have been much stronger with just the second storyline. I think the second storyline would have achieved the same thing in a similar way to Shuggie Bain, where it just creeps into your soul and stays there for a while. So that's what I think of Young Mungo. If you have read Young Mungo, I would love to hear what you thought of it in the comment section down below. Maybe avoid spoilers, but let me know what you thought of it. At the time I am publishing this, the release date is still a ways away. It is mid-February right now, and Young Mungo will be released on April 5th, 2022, at least in the United States. So if you're watching this after the release date and have read it, again, I would love to hear what you think. If you have also gotten access to it, I'd love to hear what you think. If you want to talk about Shuggie Bain, let me know what you think. If you're looking forward to this or have any thoughts on what I've talked about, let me know in the comment section down below. I will try to find the video where I talked about Shuggie Bain and put that in the description box if you'd like to check that out as well. And I am looking forward to what Douglas Stuart does next. I'd love to hear what you think of Young Mungo, if you agree or disagree. And I really appreciate your time. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.